The night Alara Marlowe decided to open the safe, she told herself it would be the last time. She had told herself that before. The penthouse sat on the 43rd floor of a building that didn't appear on any publicly available lease registry, in a city that had learned long ago not to ask questions about the Vercelli name. Rain drove itself against the floor-to-ceiling glass in hard, diagonal sheets, the kind of rain that didn't apologize for itself, kind that stripped paint and flooded gutters and made people feel like the sky had finally run out of patience. Alara stood in the dark beside the open wall panel, the safe's combination still warm on her fingertips. She wasn't supposed to be here. Dante had told her he wouldn't be back until morning. He had a meeting on the south side, something she was not permitted to ask about, the way she was not permitted to ask about most things that happened between midnight and dawn in their marriage. She had accepted that silence 17 years ago when she accepted his name, his protection, and the consequences that came stitched into both. She reached into the safe. Her fingers found it before her eyes adjusted. A photograph, sealed in a small archival envelope, she had placed there herself, years ago, during a week when Dante had been in New York and she'd had the penthouse to herself, long enough to do something she would never be able to undo. She pulled the envelope out. She did not open it. She simply stood in the dark, holding it against her chest with both hands flat, the way a person holds something they're terrified to drop. The elevator chimed. Alara did not move. The elevator chimed again, the specific double tone that meant someone had used the private key code. Not the staff elevator, not the service entrance, the residential car that went directly to this floor and no other. She had maybe 4 seconds. She shoved the envelope back into the safe. Panel wasn't fully closed when the elevator doors slid open behind her and the lights in the foyer came on automatically, spilling across the marble floor and catching her exactly where she was standing in front of the open wall. One hand still pressed against the frame, the photograph still inside, but the door wide open and the whole truth sitting there in the dark like a held breath. Dante Vercelli walked into the room and stopped. He was still wearing his coat, still damp at the shoulders from wherever he'd come in from. He had a cut above his right eyebrow that hadn't been there this morning, not deep. The kind you get when something comes close but doesn't finish the job. His eyes moved from her face to the open panel to the safe, and then back to her face. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "You're home early," Alara said. It was the worst thing she could have said. Dante crossed the room slowly. He moved the way he always moved in situations he didn't yet understand carefully, like a man who had learned that the distance between him and the next problem was usually measured in bad seconds. He reached past her and pulled the safe door fully open. He saw the envelope. He took it out. Lara said, "Dante." He opened it. The photograph was 4 inches by 6, slightly faded at the edges from the years, but the center was still clear. A woman he recognized, younger, thinner, her hair down instead of pinned, a hospital gown visible at the shoulder, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a white blanket. The woman was Alara. The baby's eyes were closed. The baby had a full head of dark hair and a face that looked like it had arrived in the world already exhausted. On the back, in Alara's handwriting, a date. 17 years ago. A hospital name he didn't recognize in a city she had never mentioned visiting. Dante turned the photograph over twice. Then he looked up at her. "What is this?" It wasn't a question. His voice had dropped to the register he used when he already knew the answer wasn't going to be simple, when the scaffolding of something was about to come apart. Alara opened her mouth. She said, "You were never supposed to find this." The first shot came through the east-facing window. Glass detonated inward across the living room. Alara dropped without thinking, an instinct built from years of being married to a man who had enemies. Dante was already moving. He had her by the arm before the second shot punched through the wall panel above the safe, and he was pulling her toward the hallway with the kind of speed that meant he'd identified the angle of fire before she'd even processed that they were under attack. "Down," he said. "I know," she said. They went down. Penthouse had a floor plan that looked like an ordinary luxury residence to anyone who didn't know what to look for. The hallway leading to the master bedroom had a closet at the far end that wasn't a closet. Dante had shown it to her once, years ago, with the flat affect of a man describing a fire escape. Behind the false wall was a stairwell that descended 3 floors to a service corridor, and from there to a parking structure that appeared on no building schematic registered with the city of Chicago. Dante moved her through it in the dark. Dante moved her through it in the dark. She could hear shouting above them, now not through the walls, but through the floor, which meant whoever had come through the windows had been followed by people who'd come through the building itself. Multiple entry points. This wasn't a hit. It was a collection. They were trying to take her. Alara understood that before Dante did, because she had spent 17 years waiting for it. Car was where it always was, a black SUV. Keys in a magnetic box beneath the rear wheel well. Gas full. Dante drove. He said nothing for 6 blocks. The rain turned the windshield into a moving watercolor. He ran 2 red lights and took a route through a neighborhood that dead-ended for anyone who didn't know about the alley behind the dry cleaning business on Polk Street. Finally, he said, "The photograph. I know. Who else knows about it?" Alara looked out the window. "That's not the right question." Alara. "The right question," she said, "is who sent those men." Dante's jaw tightened. "Same question." He drove. She said nothing. He pulled off onto a side street and stopped the car with the engine running and turned to look at her. His face in the dashboard light was not angry. It was something worse than angry. It was the expression of a man reorienting himself around new information, the same expression she had seen him use at a table when someone revealed a card he hadn't expected, the brief mechanical stillness before the calculation began. "You had a child," he said. Alara didn't answer. 17 years ago. In a city you never told me about. You had a child and you put a photograph in my safe." "Your safe," she said quietly. "Not yours. The apartment belongs to the Vercelli organization. Don't split hairs with me right now. I'm not splitting anything." He reached over and took her chin in one hand, not roughly, but precisely, the way you'd adjust a camera to see what you actually wanted to see. Turned her face toward him. "Was it mine?" he said. Question sat between them in the car. Rain against the roof. Engine idling. Alara pulled her face back slowly. "Drive," she said. Dante stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then he put the car in gear and drove. They went to a safe house on the northwest side that had not been used in 4 years. Smelled like old carpet and cold radiators. Dante locked the door, checked every room, checked every window, came back, and sat across from Alara at a kitchen table, with laminate peeling at the corners. Called Rafe. Rafe Calderone answered on the second ring. He was Dante's lieutenant, had been for 11 years. The kind of man who processed information without emotional interference, who was useful precisely because he didn't attach to outcomes. Dante told him about the attack in 4 sentences. He told him about the photograph in 2. He said, "I need to know who those men were before morning." Rafe said, "Give me 2 hours." He clicked off. Dante set the phone on the table and looked at Alara. She was sitting with both hands around a mug she'd found in the cabinet empty. Just something to hold, and her eyes were on the middle distance between them, which meant she was not looking at him and was not pretending to be doing otherwise. He had learned early in their marriage that Alara did not perform emotion. When she was frightened, she went quiet. When she was calculating, she went still. Right now she was both. "I need you to tell me," Dante said. "I know what you need." "Then I know what you need, and I'm telling you I can't give it to you yet." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were dry, which he recognized as a bad sign. "Not yet. Not tonight. Not until I understand how much you already know." "I know nothing. I know there's a photograph. I know someone tried to pull you out of my apartment with enough manpower to suggest they've been planning it. I know you're not surprised by any of this. I'm surprised you came home early. The meeting got canceled." He paused. Someone tipped Benedetti that there was going to be a problem. Made him nervous enough to push the table. Alara looked at him more carefully. "Who tipped him?" "I don't know. Someone inside your organization. Obviously." She set the mug down. "Then the meeting was never the point. Getting you out of the penthouse early was." Dante processed this. "They expected me to walk in. They expected you to walk in and find me," she said. "Or they expected me to be gone before you arrived. And find the safe empty." She stopped. "Dante, the photograph wasn't the only thing in that envelope." He was very still. "What else?" "A name and an address." She closed her eyes. "I've been moving it every few months. I don't know how long they've known it existed." "Who is they?" She opened her eyes. First, tell me about Silas. The name landed differently than she'd intended. She could see it, the almost imperceptible shift in Dante's posture, the way a man looks when a word touches something he's been keeping in a sealed room. What about Silas? Dante said. He called me, Alara said, 3 weeks ago. He told me you were thinking about expanding into the port operations on the South Harbor. He told me he was concerned about your safety. He was very warm, very avuncular. She paused. I've known Silas Vane for 12 years, and he has never once called me about anything. Dante got up from the table and walked to the window. The street outside was empty, except for a delivery truck parked on the far corner that hadn't moved in the 20 minutes they'd been here. He watched it. Silas built half of what I have, he said. I know. He was with my father before I took over. I know that too. What are you suggesting? Alara said carefully, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you that a man you trust completely called your wife out of nowhere, 3 weeks before someone sent a team to take her out of your home. And I'm asking you what that means to you. Dante watched the delivery truck. Didn't move. His phone buzzed. He picked it up without looking away from the window. Rafe had sent a text. 3 of the men were Corelli muscle, 2 unknowns. One of the unknowns had a Vercelli access card. He read it twice. An access card. Someone had given them a Vercelli access card to get into the building. He set the phone down without showing Alara and said, I need you to tell me about the child in the photograph. Alara was quiet for a long time. The radiator knocked against the wall once, twice, and then went silent. I can tell you part of it, she said finally. Tell me the part that keeps us alive, Dante said. Pulled her hands off the mug and folded them in her lap and looked at him the way she looked at him when she was about to say something that couldn't be unsaid. The child in that photograph, she said, is 17 years old. He is healthy. He does not know your name. He does not know mine. She paused. He goes by Nico. Dante came back to the table slowly. Alara, he has your hands, she said quietly. The scar on the left palm. He got it the same way you did. I don't know how that's possible, but he has it. Dante's mouth was open slightly. He does not know what he is, she continued. He does not know why I check in on him the way I do. He thinks I'm a social worker, a county case manager, someone the state assigned. Her voice stayed flat, clinical, the way she'd trained herself to report difficult information. He has been in 3 different placements in the last 4 years, and he has stayed out of serious trouble in 2 of them, which, given what he came from, is something close to a miracle. You've been watching him, Dante said. Yes. For how long? Since the beginning. Dante sat down. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face, and stayed there for a moment that felt longer than it was. When he dropped his hands, his expression had settled into something new, not the cold calculation she recognized, not the controlled anger she'd learned to read, but something rawer underneath both of those. Something that looked briefly like grief. My father told me the child died, he said. I know what your father told you. He told me the delivery went wrong. The boy was born too early. That there were complications. There were no complications, Alara said. The baby was healthy. Full term. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She said it like she'd said it to herself. So many times the numbers had worn smooth. Your father had him removed from the hospital the night he was born. I was sedated. When I woke up, told me he was gone. Gone. That's the word they used. Dante looked at his own hands. Why did you put the photograph in the safe? Alara considered the question. Because I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind, she said. Because for a long time, I wasn't sure I believed my own memory. They were very convincing. The people your father sent. They told me the grief was doing something to my perception. That I had never actually held the baby. That the morphine had... She stopped. I put the photograph there because it was the one thing that was real. How did you get it? There was a nurse, she said. A night nurse who felt bad for me. She took it on her phone and printed it and slipped it under my pillow before I was discharged. A pause. I don't know what happened to her after that. Dante was quiet. Then he said, who else knew he was alive? Alara said, I think that's what tonight was about. Someone finding out that I knew. His phone rang. It was Rafe. Dante picked up. Rafe's voice came through tight and even. He said, I found the access card trail. It goes back 14 months. Whoever's been running the inside operation has been at it longer than we thought. A pause. Dante. The card was issued by Silas. Don said nothing for 4 seconds. All right, he said. There's something else, Rafe said. I pulled the old Vercelli family records from before you took over. I was looking for anything connected to a hospital placement, a private adoption, a payment that didn't fit. Another pause, longer this time. Found a transfer. 17 years ago. Your father paid a man named Leland Cross $300,000 in untraceable accounts. Cross worked private security in foster placement. He's been dead for 9 years. Dante looked at Alara across the table. She was watching his face, reading it. Find everything Cross ever touched, Dante said. Every placement he handled. Every facility. Working on it, Rafe said. But Dante, someone else is already looking. I found another search running in our system tonight. Same record, same time frame. Who? Someone with administrative access. A pause. That's Silas-level clearance, Dante said. Don't go back to your apartment. Rafe was quiet for a moment. Already in my car. Good. Call me when you have the Cross files. He hung up. Alara said Rafe is good. He's the best I have. Then keep him close. Dante looked at her. What aren't you telling me? She didn't flinch. Several things. Start with the one that gets us killed first. She picked up the mug again, still empty, still just something to hold, and turned it in her hands. The address in the envelope, she said. The one with Nico's name. I need you to understand that whoever sent those men tonight, they didn't come because they found the photograph. The photograph has been in that safe for 2 years. They came because something changed. She sets the mug down. Someone told them the address had changed. Someone who knew I'd updated it 6 weeks ago. Dante stared at her. 6 weeks ago, he said. Yes. Who did you tell? Alara met his eyes. No one, she said. I told no one. I found the new placement myself, and I didn't write it down, and I didn't say it out loud. She paused. Which means someone has been watching me longer than either of us realized. The delivery truck outside the window finally moved. Dante watched it go. We're going to have to find him first, he said. Yes, before Silas does. Before Silas does, she agreed. Dante pushed back from the table and stood. He looked around the safe house, the peeling laminate, the cold radiator, the rain against the windows, with the expression of a man taking inventory of what he had left. Not much. A wife who had been keeping a secret for 17 years to protect a child he hadn't known was alive. A lieutenant who was loyal but suddenly exposed. An advisor who had built the empire with him and was now apparently trying to use it to take everything. And somewhere in this city, in a placement facility he didn't yet have an address for, a 17-year-old boy with his hands and his scar who had no idea his whole life was about to change. Dante picked up his phone. We move in an hour, he said. Get what you need. Alara was already on her feet. She had been ready to move for 17 years. The hour Dante gave her passed in 38 minutes. Alara came out of the back bedroom with a canvas bag over one shoulder, and her hair pulled back and her face carrying the particular blankness of someone who had decided not to feel anything until there was time for it. She had found a change of clothes in the safe house's emergency supply. Nothing that fit well. A gray zip-up 2 sizes too large, and dark jeans with a crease in the wrong place, and she had washed the dust from the broken window out of her hair in a sink with cold water and no complaint. Dante was standing at the kitchen table when she came out. He had 4 phones in front of him. His own, the safe house burner, a prepaid he'd taken from the emergency supply box behind the water heater, and Rafe's secondary number written on a piece of paper beside it. 3 of the 4 phones had already been used. She looked at his face and understood that whatever face and understood it in the Rafe had sent 38 minutes had changed the shape of something. Sit down, he said. Tell me while I'm standing. Picked up the paper. Rafe found 11 payments in the old Vercelli records going back 20 years. Not just the 300,000 to Cross. 11 separate accounts, 11 separate names, all of them connected to private placement agencies in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. He set the paper down. 6 of those agencies are defunct. 3 were shut down by state investigators for falsifying records. 1 burned. He paused. 1 is still operating. Alara felt the floor shift slightly under her. Not literally. Just the way it did when something you'd been bracing against for years finally pressed back. Which one, she said. St. Clair Family Services, Bridgeport. He looked at her. Is that where he is? She held his gaze for a moment. No, she said. He aged out of Saint Clair 14 months ago. Then where? I told you I'm not. Ilara. His voice dropped. Not loud. Never loud. With Dante, the quieter it got, the more dangerous the register. Someone inside my organizations spent 20 years building a paper trail around a child who was supposed to be dead. I need to know if the address you updated 6 weeks ago is somewhere on that list. She looked at the paper he was holding. She reached over and took it. She read through the names slowly, and he watched her read them. And whatever he was looking for in her expression, she did not give him. No, she said finally. None of these. She handed it back. He held it without looking at it. You're sure? I'm sure. A silence settled between them that had weight to it. Not the silence of two people who had nothing to say. The silence of two people who had too much and were choosing their order carefully. My father told you he was dead, Dante said. Your father had a man come to my hospital room at 6 in the morning. I had been awake for 31 hours. I had given birth at 2:17 in the morning, and I held the baby for 4 minutes before a nurse took him for evaluation. She said this without trembling. She had practiced saying it until the trembling stopped years ago. The man was polite, soft-spoken. He brought flowers. He told me there had been complications during the evaluation, that the child had not survived. She paused. I asked to see him. The man said the body had already been transported for private burial per your father's arrangements. Dante was perfectly still. He cried. Ilara said, the man your father sent. He cried in my hospital room. He was very convincing. She looked at Dante steadily. His name was Leland Cross. Something passed through Dante's face that she had not seen before. It wasn't anger. Anger was something she could chart in him. The jaw, the hands, the breath. This was older than anger. This was the look of a man discovering that the architecture of his entire life had been built on a floor that someone else had poured. He turned away from her. She let him. He stood at the window with his back to her. For a long moment, one hand against the frame, his shoulder blades pulled tight under his coat. The rain outside had softened to a steady gray nothing. My father told me you lost the baby, he said without turning. He told me you were devastated. He told me the grief had made you fragile and that I needed to give you space. A pause. That was the year I took over operations. He said the pressure of losing a child was part of why you withdrew. Ilara said quietly, I didn't withdraw, I was terrified. Of what? Of you figuring it out. She said it plainly. Because if you figured out that the baby hadn't died, the next question was where the baby was. And the answer to that question was the most dangerous piece of information in this city. Turn back around. You were protecting him from me, Dante said. I was protecting him from your world. The distinction landed between them like something thrown hard and short. Before Dante could answer, the burner phone on the table vibrated, picked it up in one motion. The text was from Rafe's secondary number, and it said, Something's wrong. My apartment, I went back. Someone was already inside. Nothing taken. But my laptop's been accessed. Running now. Dante texted back immediately. Where are you going? The response took 45 seconds, which was 45 seconds longer than Rafe usually took. I don't know yet. I'll contact when safe. Dante stared at the screen. He typed, Do not contact Silas. Do not contact anyone from the organization. Just me. He waited. No response came. He waited 2 more minutes. Still nothing. He set the phone down on the table with the face up so he could watch it and looked at Ilara and said, Rafe went back to his apartment. You heard him tell you. He was in his car. I know. Why would he go back? He wouldn't, Dante said. Unless someone told him it was safe to. They looked at each other. Ilara said, or unless he wasn't the one who texted you from his secondary number the first time. Dante picked the phone back up and scrolled to the first message. Something's wrong, my apartment. He looked at the phrasing. Rafe was precise, economic. In 11 years, Dante had never received a message from him that led with the word something. Rafe led with facts. Rafe led with specifics. Something's wrong was not specific. Dante's chest tightened in a way he didn't show. He dialed Rafe's primary number. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He dialed the secondary. Disconnected. He put the phone in his coat pocket and said to Ilara, We need to move. Where? Somewhere I choose in the next 30 seconds. He was already picking up the other phones. Not somewhere anyone's had time to plan for. They went out the back. The alley behind the safe house ran between two commercial loading docks, both dark at this hour, and emptied onto a secondary street that fed toward the expressway. Dante moved fast without appearing to. Alara matched his pace without being told to. They had done this once before. Years ago, an extraction from a hotel in Milwaukee that had gone wrong in the middle of a rainstorm, and they fell back into the rhythm of it the way people fall back into old reflexes, uncomfortably and without discussion. He pulled her into a recessed doorway halfway down the alley and stopped. 2 minutes, he said. Why? Because if we're being tracked, we'll see the response. He stood with his back to the wall, his eyes on both ends of the alley. And because I need you to tell me something. She stood beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth off her shoulder. What? The nurse, he said. The one who slipped you the photograph in the hospital. What about her? Did you ever contact her after? Ilara hesitated. One beat, one small half-second that she couldn't fully suppress. No, she said. Ilara. I said no, you hesitated. I was thinking. You don't hesitate when you're thinking, he said. You hesitate when you're deciding how much of the truth to tell. She turned her head to look at him. The alley was dark enough that he was mostly silhouette and the wet gleam of his eyes. Her name was Mara Osei, she said finally. She was a night shift nurse at Mercy General in Evanston. She was 24 years old, and she felt sorry for me, and she took a risk she shouldn't have taken. A pause. I found her 4 years after the fact. I wasn't looking for her. I was trying to track the cross payments. I'd hired a private investigator before you and I were before things were what they are. She stopped. Reorganized. She was living in Indianapolis. She'd left nursing. She had a daughter. A pause. She told me she'd been visited. A few months after the hospital, 2 men who asked her if she'd had any contact with a patient named Ilara Marlowe. Dante said nothing. She told them no, Ilara said. She said they believed her. They left without hurting her. Her voice stayed even. I paid her to relocate. I haven't had contact with her in 11 years, and I have no reason to believe she's connected to what's happening now. Dante processed this. Why didn't you tell me any of this, he said. Which part? Any part. The nurse, the investigator. Payments you found. Ilara looked back down the alley. Because when I found all of it, you were still your father's son. You believed what he told you. I didn't know yet if you would have chosen the truth or chosen him. The words hit him flatly. He didn't argue with them. The alley stayed empty for 2 minutes. No movement at either end. No headlights. Nothing. They moved. He got them into a parking structure 3 blocks north and took a car from the second level, a gray sedan that belonged to one of his secondary accounts, registered to a name that had never appeared in any Vercelli document. A name he'd set up 11 years ago for exactly this kind of contingency. He drove north. After 8 blocks, he said, "Tell me what you know about Silas that you haven't told me." Ilara turned in her seat so she was facing forward, but could see him in her peripheral vision. He was close to your father before you. I know that. Do you know how close? Dante glanced at her. What does that mean? It means I don't think Silas is operating against you, she said. I think he's operating according to a plan that was already in motion before you took over. One your father designed. She paused. Your father didn't have the boy killed, and he didn't hide him randomly. The placement agencies, the 11 payments, that's not panic. That's infrastructure. That's someone planning for a specific outcome. Dante's hands adjusted on the wheel slightly. You think my father intended to use him, he said. I think your father hid him until you were powerful enough to make use of him, and then your father died before he could tell you. She paused. And I think Silas was supposed to tell you. And I think something changed something about the timing, or the power distribution, or what Silas stood to gain, and Silas decided to use the information himself instead. The sedan moved through the wet, empty streets. Don said, if Silas has been sitting on this for years, waiting for the right moment, then the right moment is now, Ilara said. The South Harbor expansion, new territory, new leverage points. The organization is at its most stretched and most vulnerable in a decade, and Silas knows exactly where every seam is. She turned to look at Dante directly. If he controls the heir, he controls the succession. And if he controls the succession, He controls everything you've built. Dante said nothing for a long time. Then, he's been in my house. Yes. He's been at my table. Every strategy meeting. Every decision about territory, personnel, finance. He said it without inflection, but she could hear the thing underneath it, not betrayal exactly. Something more structural than that. The sound of a man realizing that the person who helped him build the walls also memorized where the doors were. He knows every weakness I have. Not everyone, Alara said. Explain. He doesn't know that I know about the payments. He doesn't know that I've been tracking Nico's placements myself, independently, using a system that has nothing to do with your organization's records. She paused. And he doesn't know that Nico knows how to disappear. Dante looked at her sharply. What does that mean? He said. It means the boy is not passive, Alara said. He's had a difficult life. He's resourceful. He's been in situations that required him to move fast and leave no trail. She held his gaze briefly. He's your son, Dante. He doesn't sit still when something comes for him. A long silence. He knows something's coming, Dante said slowly. You warned him, Alara said nothing. Alara. Did you warn him? I sent a message, she said quietly. 48 hours ago. Through a channel he and I set up 2 years ago for emergencies. I told him to move to the contingency location and to trust no one who came without the word we agreed on. Dante gripped the wheel. You contacted him, he said. Before tonight, before the attack. You already knew. I suspected. When Silas called me, her voice was steady, but her hands in her lap were not. Call. I've been counting down since that call. Car stopped at a red light. No one else at the intersection. Rain on the windows. The wipers making their slow, useless arc. Dante stared at the red light. You suspected Silas 3 weeks ago, he said. You didn't tell me. You warned the boy instead of warning me. I warned the boy because he was the target, she said. I didn't warn you because I didn't know yet how deep it went. If I told you about Silas and I was wrong, and you confronted him, and it turned out he was innocent, he would have known I was watching him. And if I was right, and you confronted him before we had anything solid, he would have moved up the timeline. You made that calculation on your own. Yes. About my organization. My advisor. My son. The word dropped out of him differently than she'd expected, raw at the edges, unpolished, like he hadn't meant to say it that way. She heard it, she let it sit. Yes, she said softly. The light went green. He drove. They were 40 minutes north of the city when the prepaid phone he hadn't given the number to anyone rang. Dante stared at it on the seat between them. It rang 4 times. Picked it up. He said nothing. From the other end, a voice he recognized immediately measured, warm, the particular warmth of a man who had learned that warmth was a useful thing to project, said, Dante. I think it's time we talked. Silas Vane. Dante looked at Alara. She had gone absolutely rigid in her seat, which told him she could hear the voice through the phone. How did you get this number? Dante said. The same way I get most things, Silas said pleasantly, carefully and well in advance. A pause. I want you to know I had nothing to do with the attack tonight. The men who came to your apartment were not mine. Whose were they? That's a complicated answer. A beat, but I can give it to you, if you're willing to have a real conversation. Kind we should have had several years ago. Another pause. I need you to bring Alara to the old harbor. The Calderon warehouse, you know the one. Come alone. Come tonight. Dante said nothing. Silas said, I know where Rafe is. Dante's knuckles on the phone went white. He's safe, Silas said. For the moment. I found him before the other side did, which is the only reason that's true. His voice stayed even. Reasonable. The voice of a man delivering facts, rather than threats which made it worse, somehow, than a threat. I'm not your enemy, Dante. I need you to believe that, even if nothing else I've said has earned it. Bring Alara. Come to the harbor. And I will tell you everything your father never had the chance to. The line went quiet, but didn't disconnect. Dante kept his eyes on the road. The harbor was 2 hours south. Rafe was there, where Silas was lying, and either answer led the same direction. Dante looked at Alara. She was looking back at him, with an expression he had not seen in 12 years of marriage, not fear, not calculation, but something between the two, the face of a woman standing at the exact moment she had been preparing for, and finding that preparation was not the same as readiness. She gave him a small nod, One nod, her chin dropping an inch and coming back. It meant I know. It meant we go. It meant there is no version of tonight that doesn't end at that harbor. Dante brought the phone back to his mouth. 2 hours, he said. He ended the call. He did not turn around. He drove south toward the harbor, toward Silas, toward whatever version of the truth had been waiting 17 years to be spoken aloud, and Alara sat beside him in silence, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward. Neither of them said another word. There was nothing left to say that the harbor wouldn't answer for them. The Calderon warehouse sat at the edge of the South Harbor like something the city had decided to forget about 3 stories of corrugated steel and water-rotted timber, kind of building that showed up in property records under a holding company that hadn't filed taxes in 6 years. Dante had used it twice before, both times for conversations he didn't want to have in a room with walls that someone else had chosen. He knew the layout. He knew the sight lines. He knew the side entrance where the lock had been replaced with a Vercelli-coated padlock 3 years ago. The padlock was already open when they arrived. He stopped the car 50 yards out and sat with the engine off for a full minute watching the building. 2 lights visible, one on the ground floor, diffused through dirty glass, and one somewhere above it, brighter, moving. Someone walking the upper level. At least 2 people inside, maybe more, which meant Silas had not come alone, which meant the call had not been a negotiation. It had been a summons, Alara said, the side entrance. I see it. The lock's open. I see that too. She turned to look at him. He wants us to come in the way you know. He's making it feel familiar. I know, that's not a comfort. That's a frame. Dante opened the door. Cold off the harbor hit him immediately, that particular lakeshore. Cold that came in wet and didn't leave. The kind that got into the joints and stayed. He came around to Alara's side before she could open her own door. Not out of chivalry, but because the side entrance was to her right, and he wanted to be between her and it until he'd cleared the approach. She understood. She let him. They went in through the side. The ground floor was mostly open space concrete, old shelving units stripped down to their frame. A cluster of folding tables near the center that had not been there the last time Dante used the building. On one of the tables was a lamp, a real one, plugged into an extension cord that ran to a generator in the corner. The generator was running quietly, which meant it had been set up well in advance, which meant all of this had been planned for longer than tonight. Silas Vane was standing beside the table. He looked exactly the same as he always looked, 62 years old. Silver-haired, built, compact, and solid. The kind of man who looked like he had been designed to appear trustworthy. He was wearing a dark overcoat and no tie, and his hands were at his sides, open, visible, which was either a genuine gesture of non-threat or a very practiced one. Behind him, 2 men stood against the far wall. Neither of them was Rafe. Dante scanned the upper level through the gap in the floor. Above, the moving light was still up there, which meant at least 1 more. 3 men that he could confirm. Possibly more in the dark. Thank you for coming, Silas said. Where's Rafe? Dante said. Silas gestured to a door at the back of the ground floor, a steel fire door, closed. Safe. He's been cooperative, which I appreciate. He paused. I want to start by being clear about something. I did not have Rafe taken. Came here. Dante looked at him. He came here, Silas repeated, because when I told him what I needed to tell him, he agreed that this conversation needed to happen. That's a distinction worth making. You're telling me Rafe walked in here willingly. I'm telling you, Rafe made a choice when he understood the full picture. Silas moved to one of the folding chairs and sat down, crossing one leg over the other, unhurried. I'd like you to make that same choice. Sit down. Both of you. Alara moved first. She walked to the near side of the table and sat, which surprised Dante, but he understood it. She was not submitting, she was positioning. The table between her and Silas meant she could watch at his hands and his eyes simultaneously. Dante remained standing. Silas looked at him with something that might have been patience, or might have been the performance of it. Your father, Silas said, was a more complicated man than you ever gave him credit for. Don't, Dante said. I'm not defending him, I'm contextualizing. Silas leaned forward slightly. 20 years ago, when Alara was pregnant, your father came to me, not the other way around. He came to me because he trusted me above every other person in the organization, and because what he needed to do required someone who could be trusted absolutely. A pause. He told me the child could not be acknowledged. That if the Benedetti family, or the Corelli family, or any of the 3 other organizations that were actively trying to dismantle the Vercelli empire at that time found out there was an heir, a blood heir, a newborn, they would take him, use him, kill him when he was no longer useful. Alara said, so he had him hidden. He had him placed, Silas said. There's a difference. Hidden implies random. Placed implies deliberate. Leland Cross was not a fixer. He was a specialist. He had been managing sensitive placements for powerful families for 20 years before your father hired him. The child was not put anywhere. He was put somewhere specific, under a specific identity with specific financial support built into a trust that would activate when he turned 21. Dante said, a trust. In the amount of $4.7 million, Silas said. Your father was not abandoning him. He was protecting him until the organization was stable enough, until you were powerful enough to bring him back without it being a death sentence for the boy. The generator hummed in the corner. One of the men against the wall shifted his weight. Dante's eyes went to the movement and came back to Silas. My father died, Dante said, 4 years after the boy was born. This was his plan. The plan died with him. Yes, Silas said. That's correct. It died with him, and it became mine to carry. He held Dante's gaze. I have been managing this, the trust, the placement monitoring, the information security for 13 years. 13 years of keeping the boy alive and the secret contained while you built the empire your father always intended you to build. He paused. I was going to tell you. When the time was right, when the harbor expansion was complete and the Corelli and Benedetti families were neutralized enough that introducing an heir wouldn't destabilize everything you'd built, Ilara said, and then something changed. Silas looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, just a degree or two of warmth dropping out. Yes, he said. Something changed. What? Dante said. Silas uncrossed his leg and leaned back in the chair and folded his hands in his lap. 3 months ago, someone else found out the boy was alive. Not through our system. Through a leak on the Corelli side, an old Cross associate, information years, and finally sold the right piece to the wrong person. He paused. The Corelli family has known about Nico for 12 weeks. They have been looking for him. Tonight's attack on your apartment was not a Corelli operation. They moved through a proxy, a group of independent contractors they use for acquisitions. Dante went very still. Alara did not look at him. The men who came for Alara tonight, Dante said slowly, were Corelli. Using Corelli muscle, yes. Through a broker, Silas looked at him steadily. They were not trying to kill her. They were trying to take her, because they knew she was the fastest route to the boy. Same as I do. Same as you do now. Dante turned and walked 3 steps away from the table and stopped with his back to both of them. For a moment, his hand pressed against the side of his neck, which was something he did when he was working hard, not to say the first thing that came to mind. He turned back. You said Rafe came here willingly, he said. Tell me what you told him, Silas said. I told him the same thing I'm telling you. That's not what I asked. A pause. I told him, Silas said carefully, that the reason he had been having difficulty verifying the Corelli connection was because someone in the organization had been feeding the Corelli family information about your movements for the last 8 months. He stopped, and that the source of that feed was not unknown to me. Dante said name. Silas said Marco Vitelli. Dante said nothing. Marco Vitelli was his financial director. Had been for 6 years. He had hired Marco personally, had vetted him personally, had brought him inside the interior circle 2 years ago when the South Harbor expansion required someone who could manage accounts across 4 separate legal entities simultaneously. Marco had been at every sensitive meeting in the last 2 years. Everyone. You can confirm this, Dante said. I have transaction records, communication logs, and 2 witnesses, Silas said. Rafe has already reviewed the documentation. That was the reason he came here when I contacted him, because he trusted my evidence more than he trusted his ability to stay safe alone with that information. A pause. Marco has been working with the Corellis for 8 months. He is the reason they knew about the harbor meeting tonight. He is the reason your apartment was vulnerable. He is the reason the access card existed. The room was very quiet. Alara looked at Dante's face. She had never seen him look precisely like this before. Not betrayed. Exactly. Not even angry. More like a man who had just watched the horizon line tilt and understood that what he'd been navigating by was wrong, had been wrong for a long time, and that the distance between where he was and where he'd thought he was could not be measured cleanly. "Where is Marco now?" Dante said. "Being held," Silas said. "Elsewhere, safely, by your people." "Yes. On my behalf," Dante said. The edge in his voice was quiet and particular. "You're managing my organization's security breach on my behalf, using your own people, without my knowledge or authorization." Silas held the gaze. "I moved when I had to move. You weren't reachable and the window was closing. I'm reachable now." "You are." Dante walked back to the table. He stood across from Silas and put both hands flat on the surface and leaned forward slightly. "Here's what I want you to understand," Dante said, his voice dropping to that. "Register the quiet. Careful, one. Everything you just told me may be completely true. The trust, the placement, Marco, the Corelli leak, all of it may be exactly as you said." He paused. "And none of it changes the fact that you have been operating inside my organization, with information about my son, for 13 years, without telling me." He let that sit. "So I need you to explain to me very carefully why. Not why my father made the choice he made. Why you made the choice to keep it from me." Silas did not look away. "Because," he said, "I wasn't sure you were ready." The air in the room changed. Dante straightened up slowly. "You decided that," he said. "Someone had to. You decided Silas Vane, my advisor, that the head of the Vercelli organization was not ready to know that his son was alive. I decided," Silas said, and his voice was still even, still measured, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before, something firmer, older, like the grain in old wood, that a man who had spent 8 years building an empire by eliminating every vulnerability around him was not yet in a position to receive information that would have immediately become his greatest vulnerability. "Yes." A pause. "I decided that, and I would decide it again." Dante looked at him for a long time. Then the steel door at the back of the room opened and Rafe walked through. Rafe Calderon looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours and had spent most of them rearranging everything he thought he knew. He was in the same clothes he'd had on that morning, one sleeve torn at the shoulder, and he walked with the careful, deliberate pace of someone whose ribs were complaining about something recent. He stopped when he saw Dante. He said, "I'm sorry." Dante said, "For what?" "For going back to the apartment." He stopped, looked at the floor, looked back up. "I thought I could pull the cross files before anyone knew I had them. I thought I had time." "You didn't." "No. Someone was already watching the system." "Marco," Rafe said. "Silas showed me the logs. Marco flagged my access the second I ran the search." He ran a hand through his hair. A gesture Dante had seen him make exactly twice in 11 years, both times when something had gone significantly wrong. "I got out before they reached me. Silas's people found me 2 blocks from my building." Dante looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him. There was a pause in which Dante was visibly deciding something. Alara could see it, the almost mechanical quality of it, the way his face went inward for a moment and then came back. He said, "Open the trust documents." Silas reached into his coat and produced a tablet. He unlocked it, pulled up a file, and slid it across the table. Dante picked it up. He read, he scrolled, he read more. Trust was real. The amount was real. The name on the document was real: Nico Marlowe, beneficiary, full release upon 21st birthday contingent on biological verification through a designated legal contact in Chicago. Dante set the tablet down. He said, "Who is the legal contact?" Silas said, "Me." There it was. Alara heard it before Dante processed it. She heard the sentence and felt the whole shape of the thing shift underneath her, because if Silas was the legal contact on the trust, then Silas was the one Nico would have to come to when he turned 21. Silas was the one who would have to confirm his identity. Silas was the gatekeeper between the boy and the money, and through the money, between the boy and everything the Vercelli name still carried with. She looked at Silas. Silas looked at her, and she understood in that moment, not suspected, understood that the trust was not a protection. It was a leash. "You're the legal contact," she said. Her voice came out flat and cold and exact. "Your father designated me," Silas said. "My father designated you 17 years ago," Dante said slowly. "Which means that when Nico turns 21, which is in 4 months, he comes to you. He has to come to you to access what his grandfather left him." Silas said nothing, and when he comes to you, Dante said, "You're the one who introduces him to the money, to the name, to whatever's left of the organization." He paused. "On your terms." Silas picked up the tablet and turned it off and put it back in his coat. He said, "I have spent 13 years keeping your son alive." "That's not an answer," Alara said. "I have spent 13 years. Silas." Dante's voice cut through it clean. "You called my wife 3 weeks ago. You sent those questions. You made her nervous enough to update the placement address. And then someone who was watching her through my organization's systems, through Marco, found out the address had changed." He stopped. "You used Marco to track her, and when she moved the address, you had it." The room went very still. Silas did not deny it. One of the men against the wall moved his hand toward his coat. Rafe said very quietly, "Don't." The man stopped. Rafe had a gun out. Dante hadn't seen him draw it, which meant either Rafe was faster than he'd thought, or Dante's attention had been entirely on Silas, which was exactly the problem. Silas looked at Rafe with an expression of genuine disappointment. "I have protected this family," he said, "for more than 20 years. By deciding what we needed to know," Alara said. "By positioning yourself as the only one who held all the pieces." She stood up from her chair. "You didn't protect this family. You managed it. There's a difference." Silas stood. He was still composed. That was the most frightening thing about him, the composure that didn't slip even now, that stayed in place like a mask that had been worn long enough to fuse. "The Corelli family knows where the boy is," he said. "Or they will within 24 hours, because Marco gave them the last known address before we picked him up. And he didn't tell us what he'd already transmitted. He let that land. I am the only person in this room who has the resources and the connections to move the boy to a location. The Corellis cannot reach before they get to him." He looked at Dante. "You need me," Dante said. "Tell me where he is." "Dante, tell me where my son is," Silas said. "Not until we have an agreement." And there it was, the thing that had been underneath all of it, the skeleton the whole conversation had been built around. Not a rescue, not a confession, a negotiation. Silas had arranged every piece of tonight to arrive at this exact table, this exact moment, with Dante's son as leverage, and Rafe neutralized, and Alara present as both witness and pressure point, and Dante with nothing to threaten, and no move that didn't go through Silas first. Rafe still had the gun up. Alara was standing. Dante looked at Silas across the table, and the thing that moved through his face in that moment was something she had never seen in 12 years. Not rage, not grief, not calculation. It was the look of a man who finally understood, completely and without illusion, what he had built and what it had cost, and who had been the one collecting the payment. Then the upper level exploded. Not literally, but the sound of it was close. Boots on metal grating, fast and multiple, and then a light went out up there, and someone came through the railing and hit the concrete floor of the ground level, hard, and didn't get up. 3 more came down the stairs, not Silas's men, not the 2 against the wall. Different men, moving differently, with the flat efficiency of people who had been waiting outside for a signal that had finally come. Corelli, they had followed Dante, or they had followed Silas. Or, and this was the thought that arrived in Alara's mind with the cold clarity of something she should have seen earlier, they had been invited. She looked at Silas. He was not surprised. He had his hands at his sides, and his face was composed, and the 2 men behind him had their weapons up now. But they were not aimed at the Corelli men coming down the stairs. They were aimed at Dante and Rafe, Silas said softly. In the sudden ringing quiet that followed the crash of the man through the upper railing, "I told you I wasn't your enemy. I meant that. But I also need you to understand that the organization you've built is no longer tenable as it stands. The Corelli family has agreed to a consolidation, a new structure, under new management." He paused. "You will still have a role, Dante, significant one. But the succession question needs to be resolved. And Nico needs to come into these to be resolved, and Nico into the organization through a framework that both families have agreed to." He looked at him with something that might have been genuine regret. This was always where tonight was going. I'm sorry it took this shape. Dante looked at the guns pointed at him. He looked at Rafe, who was calculating the same thing he was, 2 weapons on them. 3 Corelli men down from the stairs, Alara between them and the table, the side door 12 feet to the left. He looked at Alara. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the fire door at the back, the one Rafe had come through, still slightly ajar. The darkness behind it, absolute and full of the possibility that it led somewhere, or led nowhere, and that the difference between those 2 options was the only thing left that mattered. Dante said, very quietly, just for her go. She said just as quietly, not without you. One of the Corelli men took a step forward. Rafe moved not toward the door, toward the generator in the corner, and in the half-second, before anyone could process what he was doing, he kicked the power cord out of the socket and the lamp on the table, and the light above went dead simultaneously, and the warehouse dropped into a darkness that was total and immediate and full of the sound of everyone in the room recalibrating at once. Dante moved. He had Alara's wrist before the first shot came high wide, someone firing at a sound, and he was pulling her toward the back door in the dark, his shoulder catching the edge of a shelving frame, the pain sharp and immediate and ignored. A second shot. Closer. Rafe's voice from somewhere to the left. Door, 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 and then the sound of the fire door hitting its frame and the cold from outside coming through in a rush. They went through. The alley behind the warehouse was dark and wet and long, and Dante ran with Alara's hand in his and didn't look back, his lungs pulling the cold air in and burning with it, his shoulder screaming where it had caught the shelf, his mind running the calculation that his body had already started acting on. How far to the car? Which direction? Whether Silas's people knew where the car was parked, whether the Corelli men had come in from the north or the south, whether Rafe was still behind them or had gone a different way. He heard footsteps behind them, one set, the right weight, not running like a hunter, running like someone who also needed to not be where they'd been. Rafe. They came out of the alley onto a service road that ran parallel to the waterfront, and Dante turned south without stopping, because north was where the Corelli vehicles had come in, and from he had clocked the headlights on approach and filed it, and now it came back, and they ran for the car, and the car was where he'd left it, untouched, still dark, and he got Alara in and got in himself and got the engine running before Rafe had finished pulling the back door closed. He drove without lights for 2 blocks. Then he turned them on and drove like a person who was not running. Rafe said from the back. Breathing hard, he set it up. Yes, Dante said. The whole thing. Bringing us to the harbor. Corell was already there. Yes. He was going to hand us over. Hand me over, Dante said. Alara he needs. Me he was willing to trade. Rafe was quiet for a moment. He said consolidation. Under new management. He meant himself. Alara said from the passenger seat. Her voice was level and exhausted. He's made a deal with the Corellis. He delivers Dante. He delivers Nico through the trust. He becomes the bridge between both families. The man who solved the succession problem. She paused. He becomes untouchable. Dante drove. The harbor fell away behind them, and the city opened up ahead, wet and lit and indifferent. His shoulder was bleeding. He could feel it. Now, the warmth spreading through his shirt. The shelf edge had been sharper than he'd registered, and his hands on the wheel were steady, but his mind was not. He had nothing. No safe house that Silas didn't know. No organization he could trust with Marco inside it. No allies he could call, without wondering whether Silas had gotten there first. No leverage except Alara, who knew where Nico was, and would not tell him, while Silas still be able to intercept the information. No time, because the Corelli family had the last known address, and 24 hours was a generous estimate. He had Rafe, who was bleeding from somewhere he hadn't mentioned, and was being stoic about it in the back seat. He had Alara, who had spent 17 years preparing for exactly this night, and was the only person in any of this who had never once acted in her own interest. And he had a son, somewhere in this city, who knew how to disappear, who had been warned, who had his hands and his scar and his grandfather's blood, thus, and who was 17 years old and alone. Dante said, "Tell me where he is." Alara looked at him. "If I tell you," she said, "and Silas has this car, if there's a tracker, if they followed us farther than we think. Tell me anyway. She looked at his hands on the wheel, at the blood coming through his shirt at the shoulder, at his face, which was the face of a man who had reached the end of the version of himself that had gotten him this far. She said, he's in a group home on Linden Avenue, in Evanston, Unit 4, second floor. He'll be gone by tomorrow morning if he followed my instructions. She paused. The word is harbor. You say that word to him and he'll know you came from me. Dante took the next ramp north. Rafe said quietly, from the back, Dante, if Silas already has people moving. I know, Dante said. We're 3 people, with 1 working gun between us and your shoulder is. I know, Dante said. The car accelerated onto the expressway, heading north toward Evanston, toward a group home on Linden Avenue, toward a 17-year-old boy who did not know his name or his history, or the fact that the city had been rearranging itself around him for his entire life. Dante drove with his hands steady and his shoulder bleeding, and the full weight of 17 years of his father's decisions pressing down on him like something structural, like a ceiling that had been cracking for years and had finally decided tonight was the night. He could not go back to the harbor. He could not go back to the organization. He could not go back to the man he had been this morning, who had believed that Silas Vane was trustworthy, that his lieutenants were secure, that the empire he'd built was solid beneath him. All of that was gone. What was left was the road north and a word harbor, and the very first real choice he had made in 17 years that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with what came after it. The group home on Linden Avenue was a 3-story Victorian that the city had been meaning to renovate for a decade, and hadn't. It sat between a laundromat and a vacant lot, the kind of building that absorbed the neighborhood's noise without reflecting any of it. Back, closed curtains, a porch light that worked half the time, a front walk with a crack running down the center that no one had filled in 2 winters. Dante killed the headlights a block south and coasted to a stop. His shoulder had stiffened in the 40 minutes it took to drive from the harbor. The bleeding had slowed. Rafe had pressed a folded gas station receipt against it in the back seat, which was almost funny, kind of field dressing that said, we are entirely out of good options. But the muscle had tightened around the wound, and every shift of his arm above the elbow sent a specific clarifying pain down into his fingers. He could still drive. He could still shoot, if it came to that. He was trying not to think about whether it would come to that. Rafe leaned forward from the back seat. 2 vehicles on the north side of the block, he said quietly. Dark. No plates visible from here. Dante had already seen them. A van and a sedan, both parked with their noses pointing south, which was not how people parked on this street, unless they intended to leave quickly in the direction they were already facing. Silas, Alara said. Or Corelli, Rafe said, or both. Dante said, how long ago did you send the message to Nico? 48 hours, Alara said. He should be gone. Be. He's resourceful. He's 17. So were you once? She said, and you survived things that should have killed you. He looked at the building. 2nd floor, Unit 4, 1 window visible from this angle, a light behind it, dim, the kind of light a phone makes when someone is lying in the dark, looking at a screen. Someone was still up there. He didn't follow the instructions, Rafe said. Couldn't, Alara said. Or he chose not to, Dante thought, because he was 17 and resourceful and stubborn. And if Alara was right about the inheritance, the kind of person who didn't move when someone told him to move until he understood why, that quality was either going to get him killed in the next 20 minutes, or it was the one thing that had kept him in that room long enough to be found. Dante opened the car door. Rafe said, your shoulder, fine. It is not fine. Then it's manageable. He looked back. I need you on the north end. If those vehicles move, I need to know before they reach the front walk. And if they move before you're out, then I'm not out and we have a different problem. He looked at Alara. Stay, she said. No, Alara. He doesn't know you, she said. He knows the word. He knows my voice. You walk in there alone and he runs. She held his gaze. I'm coming. Dante wanted to argue. He had the words ready. They were the wrong words for the situation, and he knew it. And he said, stay behind me, which was not agreement, but was the closest thing to it the next 30 seconds would allow. They went in through the side yard. The gate latch was broken, bent inward like someone had come through it recently. And in a hurry, and Dante filed that without stopping. Side door to the building was unlocked, which meant either the staff kept it that way, or someone had already come through. He went in, low and fast, Alara a step behind him. The stairwell immediately to the right, dark except for a fire exit sign at the top that threw everything in red. Second floor. The hallway smelled like old carpet and something fried from hours ago. 4 doors. Unit 4 was the last one on the right. Dante stopped outside it. He could hear breathing on the other side. Not panicked breathing. Controlled, measured the breathing of someone who listening as hard as they could. He said quietly, "Harbor." A silence, a long one. Then the door opened 2 inches on a chain, and one eye looked out at him, dark, sharp, calibrating, and then moved to Alara, and something in it shifted. "You're late," the boy said. Alara said, "I know. Unlock the chain." Chain came off. The door opened. Dante's first full look at Nico Marlowe lasted maybe 3 seconds, which was long enough. The boy was tall, taller than he'd expected, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that was still finishing the process of becoming what it was going to be. The jaw and the brow coming in, hard, the eyes carrying something older than the rest of him. He was wearing jeans and a gray hoodie and a backpack on one shoulder that was already zipped, which meant he'd been ready to move and had decided not to, for reasons Dante not understand. He looked at Dante the way people look at something they've been told about, without quite believing. His eyes went to the left hand, the scar. He looked at his own left hand, palm out, the same scar in the same place, running from below the index finger to the base of the thumb. He looked back at Dante's face. He said, "You're him." Dante said, "Yes." Nico said, "I'm not calling you Dad." "That's fine. I mean it. Don't make this something it isn't." "I won't." The boy looked at Alara. "There are people outside." "We know," Alara said. 2 vehicles. North side. A man in a gray coat walked the front of the building 20 minutes ago. He looked at the second floor window for about 10 seconds, and then walked back. He paused. "I turned the light off after that, but I think he already saw it." Dante looked at him. "How do you know it was 20 minutes? "I timed it." "Why?" "Because if they were coming in, they would have come in already, which meant they were waiting for something. Or someone." He looked at Dante steadily. "I figured it was you." This kid had been waiting in a dark room for Dante to arrive because he'd calculated that the people outside were using him as bait and that the only way out was through whoever came through the door first. 17 years old, in a group home on Linden Avenue, alone. Dante's chest did something he didn't have time for. He said, "Is there a back way out of this building?" "Basement. Laundry room has a window that opens into the alley. Is the window big enough?" Nico looked at him flatly. "I've used it before." "Let's go," Dante said. They went back into the hallway and down the stairs, Dante first, Alara and Nico behind him. The stairwell dim and the fire exit sign throwing its red light across everything. Ground floor. The laundry room was off a short corridor past the house common room. Door propped open with a plastic chair. The room itself smelling like detergent and damp concrete. The window was ground level on the outside. Basement high on the inside, a horizontal rectangle above a bank of dryers. The kind of window that required a step up and a committed angle to get through. Dante's phone vibrated. "Rafe, van is moving, coming south. 30 seconds. Dante looked at Nico. "Go." Nico went up and through the window with the efficiency of someone who had done it before and not recently learned the skill. Alara went next. Dante gave her a knee boost and she pulled herself through without discussion. Dante followed, his shoulders screaming as he pulled his own weight up and through, the wound reopening somewhere in the effort, the warmth spreading again through his shirt. He got through. The alley was dark and cold and ran east. They went east. Behind them, back toward the building, Dante heard the front door open heavy. Institutional, the sound carrying clearly in the cold air, and then voices, low and directed, the kind of voices that were organizing a search pattern. Silas's people. Not Corelli came in loud. Silas's people came in quiet, which was worse. Rafe came around the east end of the alley at a half-run and pulled up when he saw them. "Van parked at the front," he said, breathing harder than usual, which meant his ribs were worse than he'd been letting on. 3 men went in. I counted a 4th staying with the vehicle. "How many from the sedan?" 2. "They went around the back. I lost them when you came through the window." which means they're in the alley behind us, Nico said. Everyone looked at him, he said. The alley runs west back to the building and east to the laundromat service road. If they went around back and they're good at this, they've already cut off the west end and they're moving east to box us. He looked at Dante. How long do we have? Dante said 30 seconds. Maybe less. Nico pulled his hood up. Laundromat has a loading dock on the service road. The dock door is usually unlocked after 10 because the night manager props it for cigarette breaks. Through the laundromat is a front entrance onto Linden, and from Linden you can go north toward the campus or south toward the L. Dante stared at him. I've thought about exits, Nico said with a flatness that made the sentence sadder than he probably intended. I've lived here 8 months. I think about exits. They went through the laundromat. The dock door was unlocked. The night manager was not on a cigarette break. He was behind the counter, watching something on his phone with headphones in, and didn't look up. They went through the folding area and past a row of machines, and out the front door onto Linden and turned north, walking fast but not running. Because running onto Lit Street is a signal, and Dante had enough of those working against him already. His shoulder was soaking through now. He could feel it tracking down his side, a slow, warm persistence. He kept his arm tight to his body. Rafe said quietly, "We need to stop somewhere. We need to get clear first. Your shoulder needs. I know what my shoulder needs." His voice came out harder than he meant it. Pulled it back. 10 minutes. Get us 10 minutes clear and then we stop. They walked north. Nico moved beside Alara, not beside Dante. He had not looked at Dante since the alley. He kept his backpack on both shoulders now, and his hood up and his eyes moving the way Dante's moved, checking, cataloging, not settling. 2 blocks north, Dante turned them into a 24-hour diner that he chose, because it had a back booth visible from the door, a second exit through the kitchen, and enough ambient noise from the counter staff and the overnight regulars that a conversation would not carry. They took the back booth. Rafe went to the counter and came back with coffee and a fistful of paper napkins, and pressed the napkins against Dante's shoulder without asking and held pressure without making an event of it. Nico sat across from Dante. He wrapped both hands around a coffee mug he hadn't ordered. A waitress had put it down automatically, the way they did for anyone who sat in a booth at 2 in the morning and looked at the table. He said, "How bad is it?" "What?" Dante said. "All of it." He looked up. "She sent the warning 48 hours ago. That's not standard. That means she knew something was coming and it was serious enough to use the emergency channel." He looked at Alara. "And you came with him, which means you trust him enough to bring him to me, which you said you would never do unless there was no other way." He paused. "So, how bad?" Alara looked at Dante. Dante said, "Someone who I trusted for a long time has decided to use you to take control of what I built. He has a legal claim on a trust your grandfather set up for you. He's made a deal with a rival organization, and he has more resources and more people than I have access to right now." Nico processed this. "The trust," he said. "Yes, the one that activates when I turn 21. Dante looked at him. "You knew about it." "I found documents," Nico said, "in the St. Clair files, before I aged out. A case manager left something in my folder that wasn't mine. A legal reference to a trust account under my name." He pulled his coffee closer. "I didn't know what it meant. I didn't look into it because looking into it felt like opening something I wasn't ready to open." He paused. "I turned 21 in 4 months. I know, and this man, the one who made the deal, he controls access to it. He's the designated legal contact." Nico was quiet for a moment. "Can that be changed?" he said. Dante said, "Not without documentation and a legal process that takes time we don't have." "What do we have time for?" Rafe said. From behind the napkins, he was still pressing to Dante's shoulder. "We have time to get somewhere safe and think." "Where is safe?" Nico said. "Because the place you came from, wherever it was tonight, clearly wasn't." Dante looked at his son across the diner table. The kid was not panicking. He was not performing bravery either. That was the thing that struck Dante most clearly, more than the scar, more than the hands, more than the specific angle of the jaw. He was just thinking. Hard and fast and without drama, the way someone thinks when they have spent a significant portion of their life in situations where panic was a resource they couldn't afford. Dante said, "I have a property, off the books, not connected to my name or the organization. I bought it 11 years ago through a shell that even Silas doesn't know about. Rafe looked at him. Dante said, I didn't tell anyone about it, including you. Rafe absorbed this without visible offense. How far? 40 minutes northwest. Then we go, Rafe said. Dante put money on the table without counting it, and stood and put his coat back on, over the napkins and the wound, and they went out. The car was where Rafe had left it, 2 blocks south of the diner, uncompromised. They drove northwest in silence for the first 15 minutes, Nico in the back, with Rafe, Alara, in front, peeling away on either side as they hit the outer neighborhoods and the lights thinned. Then Nico said, from the back, tell me about him. Dante kept his eyes on the road. Your grandfather, Nico said. Tell me what he was like. A silence. Alara looked at Dante. He said he was a man who believed that protecting people meant controlling everything around them. He thought if he could manage every variable, he could guarantee safety. A pause. He was wrong, but he believed it completely. Nico said, is that what you believe? Dante said nothing for a moment. I did, he said. Time. And now, Dante said, now I'm driving northwest at 2 in the morning with a hole in my shoulder and no organization and no leverage and one property that might still be secure. So, whatever I believed before tonight is no longer particularly relevant. From the back seat, almost inaudibly, Nico made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh and then wasn't. Property was a farmhouse that wasn't a farm, 2 acres northwest of the city, bought through a name Dante had used once, and never again, maintained through a property management company that received its instructions through a post office box in Indiana. The house was cold when they got inside. Dante found the breaker box and got the heat running, and found supplies in the basement, canned goods, water, a first aid kit that was military grade and several years out of date, but still functional. Rafe opened the kit on the kitchen table and looked at Dante's shoulder with the detached assessment of a man who had seen worse. Through and through, he said. The shelf edge was sharp enough to cut clean. You need stitches. Do it, Dante said. Rafe did. Dante sat at the kitchen table with his shirt off and his jaw set and did not make a sound while Rafe worked, which took 12 minutes and was not pleasant, and which Alara watched from the doorway without looking away, which was its own kind of statement. Nico sat at the far end of the table and watched too. When it was done, and Dante had a shirt back on, and the color was coming back to his face from where it had gone during the stitching, Nico said, what's the plan? Dante said Silas needs to be exposed. To who? Rafe said. The organization is compromised. The Corellis are his partners now. The other families, Benedetti. The others, they don't move on testimony alone. Not testimony, Dante said. Documentation. He looked at Rafe. Silas kept records. He kept everything. That's how he operated. That's how he maintained control over everything he touched. 13 years of managing the trust, the placements, the payments, it's all documented somewhere, because Silas would never operate without a paper trail that proved his version of events. Which means he also has a kill switch, Rafe said. A way to destroy the records if anyone gets too close. Which means we get to them before he does. Rafe said, Dante. He has people. He has the Corelli backing. He has Marco. We have 3 people in a farmhouse, and he stopped. Looked at Nico. Corrected 4. Nico said, where does he keep them? They both looked at him. The records, Nico said. Where does he keep them? Dante said, his office has a private server. Physical. Not cloud. Silas doesn't trust remote storage. It's in the building he uses on West Jackson, the one that's registered to a property holding company. He paused. It's also where he keeps the trust documentation originals. If we get those, Alara said from the doorway, we get the trust transferred. If we get those, Dante said, we get everything. Every payment. Every placement. The Corelli deal documentation. Everything Silas has been building for 13 years. He looked at Rafe. It ends him. Rafe said, West Jackson is not an empty building. No, he'll have people there. Especially tonight, he knows we got out. He knows we'll be looking for leverage. And the first place he'll lock down is anywhere that has something we can use against him. Yes, Dante said. So we walk into a building that Silas has already fortified. With 3 people and 1 gun. Dante said 4. Rafe looked at him. Dante looked at Nico. Nico said, I'm not a fighter. I know, Dante said. That's not what I need. A pause. The building on West Jackson has a network connection that routes through a secondary server in the basement, Dante said. Silas had it set up that way so the primary server upstairs would be invisible to standard network searches. The secondary server runs a maintenance loop that anyone with basic access can reach remotely. He stopped. Can you work with that? Nico looked at him steadily. You're asking if I can get into a server. I'm asking if you've ever done it before. Pause that answered the question before the words did. What do you need from it? Nico said. Access to the primary. Pathway to copy the files before Silas can trigger the wipe. Nico pulled his backpack onto the table and unzipped it. Inside was a laptop, a portable drive, 2 burner phones, a change of clothes, and granola bar. He took out the laptop. How much time will I have once I open the connection? He said. Dante looked at Rafe. Rafe said, if Silas has a monitoring alert on the secondary, and he will maybe 4 minutes before someone in the building notices. And you need to be in the building to keep them from noticing, Nico said. Yes, Dante said. Nico opened the laptop. He looked at the screen for a moment, then looked up at Dante. 4 minutes is enough, he said, if everything goes right. Dante said, things haven't been going right tonight. Nico said no, but I work better under pressure. He paused. Apparently that's genetic. Alara made a sound from the doorway that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and she pressed her hand against her mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Nobody commented on it. They worked through the next hour with the farmhouse's one functional lamp, throwing yellow light across the kitchen table, Nico on the laptop, mapping the server architecture from what Dante could describe, Rafe cleaning and checking the one weapon they had between them. Dante, on the prepaid phone, making 2 calls he had never made in 12 years of running the organization. Calls to people so far outside the Vercelli structure that Silas had never thought to monitor them, calling in debts that had been sitting untouched since before the organization was what it was now. He was building something from the parts he had left. It was not Citiv. It was not the Empire. It was 4 people in a farmhouse and 2 outside and a 17-year-old with a laptop and 4 minutes of access. It was what there was. At 4 in the morning, Rafe looked at the plan they had drawn out on the back of a paper bag from the supplies in the basement and said, this works if everything goes exactly as planned. Dante said, it doesn't have to go exactly as planned. It has to go well enough. There's a version of this where Silas has the building locked to the point we can't get to the server room at all. Yes, and a version where he has more people than we're accounting for. Yes. And a version where the 4 minutes isn't enough. Dante said, Rafe. Yeah, I know all the versions. He held his gaze. I'm going anyway. Rafe looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up the weapon from the table and checked it again. It didn't need checking again. He'd already done it twice, but it was something to do with his hands while he decided. He said, all right. Dante turned to Nico. You stay outside, he said. You're on the laptop in the car. When I give you the signal, you open the connection. 4 minutes. Whatever you get in 4 minutes, you get. Nico said, and if you don't give the signal, a pause. Then you and Alara drive north, and you don't come back, Dante said. Nico looked at him with an expression that was too old for his face. I'm not doing that, he said. Nico, you just found me, he said. I'm not driving away. He said it simply without heat, the way you say something that is not an argument, but a statement of the way things are. So make sure you give the signal. Dante held his son's gaze across the kitchen table of a farmhouse he'd bought in secret 11 years ago, against a day he hadn't been able to name, but had always known was coming. He said, make sure you're ready when I do. The drive back into the city took 35 minutes. West Jackson was dark and wet, and mostly empty at 4:30 in the morning. The kind of block that looked abandoned from the street, but wasn't. Dante had Rafe drive past once without slowing. The building's ground floor lights were on. A van parked at the back entrance, visible from the cross street. 3, maybe 4, inside, Rafe said. Marco could be in there, Dante said. Could be. If he is, he's a problem. If he's not, someone's been told to expect us. Rafe said, either way. Either way, Dante agreed. He looked back at Nico in the rear seat. Nico had the laptop open on his knees, the screen's light on his face, and he was looking at Dante. "Ready," Nico said. Dante turned back to face front. Rafe parked on the cross street, nose out, engine running. Dante opened the door. The cold hit him immediately, the same cold as the harbor, the same wet nothing of a Chicago morning that didn't care what was at stake. Shoulder pulled with every breath, the stitches tight and functional, but not comfortable. He looked at Alara. She had not said a word in the last 20 minutes. She said now quietly, "Come back." He said, "I intend to." He and Rafe went toward the building. The side entrance was where Dante remembered it, a steel door with a keypad lock that he'd had the code to for 6 years. He entered it. The keypad blinked red. Silas had changed the code. Of course he had. Rafe looked at him. Dante looked at the door. He said, "New plan," and hit the door with his shoulder, the wrong shoulder. The bad one, the one with 6 stitches in it that were very much not designed for this. And the pain was immediate and total and white hot, and he did not stop because the latch was old and the frame was older, and on the second impact the door came open with a sound like something structural giving up. He went through on momentum and adrenaline and the very specific kind of clarity that comes when everything stops being a plan and becomes just the next 10 seconds and then the 10 after that. Rafe was right behind him. The ground floor hallway was lit and empty. Stairs at the far end. A voice from somewhere. Above, someone reacting to the sound of the door. Dante moved. He hit the stairs at full speed, which was not the tactical choice, but it was the only one that kept surprise on his side. For the next 15 seconds, and he took the first landing and the second without stopping, and the man at the top of the second flight saw him and reached for something, and Rafe came up fast from the left, and the man went down without a shot fired, which was the best possible outcome because every shot fired in this building was a second off the clock. Dante stepped over him and kept moving. The server room was 3rd floor. East side, he'd been in it twice, both times with Silas, both times in a context that had not involved any of this. The door was closed. He tried it, unlocked, which was wrong. Stopped. Rafe came up beside him and read his face and stopped too. The door was unlocked in a building where Silas had already changed the entrance code. Dante pushed the door open from the side, not standing in front of it. The room was exactly as he remembered: racks of equipment, blinking status lights, the hum of cooling fans. And in the center of the room, seated in the single chair at the small desk, with his hands folded on the surface and his silver hair and his composed expression, was Silas Vane. He looked at Dante. He said, "I expected you an hour ago." Dante stepped into the room. Silas said, "There are 2 men outside this door, not inside outside, because I wanted to have this conversation first." He gestured to the server rack behind him. "I want you to understand something before you do whatever you came here to do." He paused. "I have a dead man's switch on this server. If I don't enter a code every 6 hours, everything on it wipes automatically." He met Dante's eyes, "which means you can't take what's here without me, and you can't threaten me into giving it to you without me activating the wipe manually." He paused. "Which means we are, right now, exactly where I need us to be." Dante stood in the doorway of the server room. His shoulder was bleeding again. He could feel it, the stitches having done their best, and now past it. His gun was in his hand. Rafe was at his back. The server was 3 feet behind Silas, and the dead man's switch was either real or a bluff, and the difference between those 2 options was the only question that mattered. From his coat pocket, his phone buzzed once. Nico's signal. He was in. The 4 minutes had already started. Silas watched Dante's face and saw something there he hadn't expected. Not panic, not calculation, but the particular stillness of a man who has just realized that the variable Silas hadn't accounted for was already running. Dante looked at Silas across the room. He said, "How long does your wipe take to execute?" Silas said, carefully, 30 seconds from activation. Dante said, "Then you have about 3 minutes and 20 seconds to decide whether to push it." Silas's composure shifted, not broke. It shifted. The first hairline crack in something that had been solid all night. Because he was doing the math now, the same math Dante was doing. And the math said that someone outside this building had already opened a connection to the secondary server. He said, "Who?" Dante said, "My son." And the word landed in the server room between them like something that had been waiting the entire night to be said out loud, not as a threat, not as a boast, but as a simple statement of the thing that Silas had built his entire plan around controlling, and had, in the end, failed to account for at all. Silas reached for the keyboard. Dante moved. Dante crossed the server room in 3 steps. Silas's hand was already on the keyboard, 2 fingers extended, reaching for the key sequence that would execute the wipe, and Dante caught his wrist before the fingers landed, catching it hard and pulling it back and away from the desk with the full weight of his body behind the motion, which sent a bolt of pain through his shoulder, so direct and total that his vision went white at the edges for a half second. He did not let go. Silas was stronger than he looked. He always had been. That was something Dante had known abstractly for years, and was now learning specifically. His fingers locked around a wrist that was pulling against him with a focused, precise resistance, not panicked, just determined. The chair scraped back. Silas came up out of it and used the momentum to turn, trying to bring his free hand to the keyboard from the other side. Rafe hit the keyboard off the desk entirely. It clattered to the floor and slid under the rack of equipment, and the input was gone, and Silas stopped pulling. The 3 of them stood in the server room in the sudden quiet of people who have just used everything they had. Silas looked at his wrist in Dante's hand. He looked at the keyboard on the floor. He looked at the status lights on the server rack, which were still green, still running, still intact. He said, "You have no idea what you've started." Dante released his wrist. He took a step back and breathed deliberately, the way you breathe when the adrenaline is demanding something your body can't sustain. He said, "The Corelli deal, the trust documents, the placement records, everything you've kept on that server for 13 years. He looked at Silas directly. "My son has been in your secondary system for the last 3 minutes. He doesn't need 4. He told me 4 to be safe." Silas looked at him. The composure was still there. It was remarkable. Genuinely, the degree to which the man held it, but something behind it had gone very still in a different way than before. The stillness of someone recalculating from 0. He said, "The boy doesn't know what he's looking at." "He knows what a trust document looks like," Dante said. "He found reference to this one 2 years ago in a case file. He's been thinking about it since." He paused. "He's had a lot of time to think." "You made sure of that?" Silas said nothing. "Sit down," Dante said. Silas sat. Dante pulled out the prepaid phone. His hands were steadier than they had any right to be. He opened the recording function and set the phone on the desk between them. He said, "Tell me about the night my son was born." Silas looked at the phone. He looked at Dante. He said, "You can't use a coerced recording in any legal proceeding." "I'm not interested in legal proceedings," Dante said. "I'm interested in the other 5 families who have been watching my organization expand for 2 years and wondering whether I'm stable enough to trust with the South Harbor consolidation. I'm going to send them what's on that server and what's on this recording and let them decide." He paused. "You've made a deal with the Corellis, the Benedettis, the Sullivans, the Marchand Group. None of them want Corelli dominance. You know that. They'll turn on the deal the second they see the documentation." He looked at Silas with something that was not anger and was not satisfaction, just clarity. The particular clarity of a man who has finally stopped underestimating the pieces on the board. Corelli Alliance falls apart, and you have nothing. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Rafe stood at the door with his arms crossed and his face carrying the expression he used when he was being patient about something he had already decided. From Dante's pocket, the phone buzzed twice. Nico's signal. Transfer complete. Dante kept his eyes on Silas. Silas said, "Your father loved that boy. Came out differently than anything else he'd said. All night quieter, without the careful architecture of a man constructing an argument. Just a sentence." Dante said, "Tell me." "He came to me the night Alara went into labor," Silas said. "He was. I had never seen him frightened before that night. Not genuinely. He was frightened because he understood what an heir meant in the environment we were operating in. The Corelli family had tried 3 times that year to breach our inner structure. The Benedettis had informants inside 2 of our financial operations." He paused. "He said to me, if they know there is a child, they will take him, and he will be dead before the year is out." He said it the way he said things when he had already decided. He looked at his own hands on the desk. "He asked me to help him protect the boy, to build something that would last until the danger had passed." He stopped. I said yes. I have always said yes to your father, because he was right more often than any man I have ever known. Dante said, "And when he died?" "When he died, I had a choice," Silas said. "Tell you immediately," which meant introducing a target into an organization that was in the middle of its most dangerous transition. Or wait. He looked up. I waited too long. That's true. I waited long enough that the waiting became its own kind of power, and I stopped being entirely sure whether it was protecting the boy or protecting my position. He said it plainly, without apparent shame, which was somehow worse than shame would have been. Both, probably. People who tell themselves they're doing something purely for someone else's benefit are usually lying. Dante picked up the phone and stopped the recording. He said, "Is there anything else on that server that isn't on the records?" Nico pulled. Silas said the Corelli contract, the specifics of the consolidation arrangement, documented. "Everything I do is documented." "Then Nico has it." Dante pocketed the phone. He looked at Silas for a long moment, at the silver hair and the composed face and the 62 years of careful maneuvering that had brought them to this room at 4:30 in the morning. "Going to have you killed?" Silas looked at him. "That's what you expected," Dante said. "That's what my father would have done. That's what this organization has always done with problems. It can't absorb." He paused. "I'm going to send the documentation to the other families, and to 2 journalists I trust, and to a federal prosecutor who has been looking for leverage on the Corelli organization for 4 years. He held Silas's gaze. "You're going to disappear. Not because I'm running you out. Because when this documentation goes public, staying visible will be the most dangerous you can do. The Corellis will want to eliminate the liability. The other families will want to send a message." He paused. "You built yourself into every corner of this organization. Now those corners are gone. Go somewhere. No one knows your name." Silas looked at him for a long time. He said, "You're letting me go." "I'm letting the consequences go," Dante said. "You'll find they keep up." He turned and walked out of the server room. Rafe followed. The 2 men Silas had stationed outside the door were there. They had heard everything through the inadequate insulation of the hallway, or enough of it, and they looked at Dante and then at each other with the specific expression of men who had just realized that whoever they'd been hired by was no longer a viable employer. Dante looked at them. He said, "Go home." They went downstairs and out through the broken side door and into the cold West Jackson morning. Dante stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the air that smelled like exhaust and rain and the particular nothing smell of the city before dawn. His shoulder hurt deeply and specifically, and he was more tired than he could remember being since the year his father died. Rafe came out behind him. He said, "Marco." "Yes," Dante said. "He's still being held somewhere." "I know." When the documentation goes to the prosecutor, Marco becomes a witness. He'll want a deal. He looked at Rafe. "Let him have one. Whatever he gives them is more useful than whatever we do with him." Rafe said, "That's not how we've handled things before." "No," Dante said. "It's not." Rafe considered this. He was not a man who processed change quickly. He processed it correctly, which was different and took longer. He said, "All right." The car was on the cross street. They walked to it. Nico was in the back with the laptop closed on his knees, and Alara was in the front, and they both looked at the two men walking toward them from the building and read their faces and understood that it was over in the way that the end of something is never fully clean, but is definably finished. Dante opened the back door and looked at Nico. He said, "You get everything." Nico said, "Everything on the primary server. Trust documents, placement records, the Corelli contract, 13 years of financial transfers." He paused. "There was also a folder I wasn't looking for. Personal files." He met Dante's eyes. "Letters," said. "From who, your father?" A pause. "To me. He wrote letters to me, dated every year, from the year I was born until the year he died." He looked at the laptop. "He never sent them. They were just there. On the server." He stopped. "He knew my placement. He checked on me. He stopped again." The sentence didn't need finishing. Dante looked at his son's face in the gray pre-dawn light coming through the car window. He said, "Do you want them?" Nico said, "I don't know yet." "That's a fair answer. It's an honest one." Dante said, "Those are usually the same thing." He got in. Alara looked at him as he settled into the passenger seat, at his face, at his shoulder, at the exhaustion that had moved past the point where it showed dramatically, and into the point where it was just present, a condition rather than an event. She said, "It's done." He said, "It's done." She put her hand over his on the console. Just that, her hand over his, both of them, cold from the morning. He turned his palm up and held it. Rafe drove. The next 72 hours were the hardest kind of work, not physical, not dangerous, just relentless, and requiring the specific form of attention that exhausted people have the hardest time sustaining. Dante sent the documentation to the 5 other families through channels that were old enough to predate Silas's involvement in the organization. He sent the recording and the server files to the 2 journalists, both of them known for accuracy over speed, both of them careful enough to verify before publishing, which was what he needed. He sent the Corelli contract specifically, and the proof of Marco's communication logs, to the federal prosecutor's office through a lawyer he'd retained for exactly this kind of contingency 11 years ago and had never had to use until now. Marco gave his deal within 18 hours. The Corelli alliance collapsed within 36. When the Benedetti and Sullivan families received the consolidation documentation and understood that the deal had been made without their knowledge and at their direct expense, fallout was loud and fast and did not require Dante to do anything except stay out of the way. Silas was gone by the time the journalists published. No forwarding address, no contact, no last message. He had done exactly what Dante had told him to do, which was either a sign of pragmatism or a sign that Hehi understood the alternative, and the difference between those two didn't matter much at that distance. The Vercelli organization, as a functioning entity, ended on a Tuesday morning when the financial accounts were frozen by federal order, and 3 of its senior members were taken in for questioning. 2 of them had been on Silas's payroll for longer than Dante's. One had been on Dante's. Dante did not fight the freeze. He did not move to preserve the structure. He sat in a hotel room with Rafe and Alara and Nico and a pot of bad coffee, and watched it go the way you watch something you've built come down, not without feeling, but without the impulse to stop it, because stopping it would have meant being the person who built it, and that person was no longer exactly who he was. Rafe left on a Thursday. He came to Dante in the hotel room early in the morning before the others were up, with his coat on and a bag over his shoulder, and his face carrying the expression of a man who had already said goodbye in his head and was now finding the actual version more complicated. He said, "I don't know where I'm going." Dante said, "Yes, you do." Rafe almost smiled. "Yeah, probably." He set something on the table, a phone, one of the prepaid ones from the farmhouse. "If you need me," Dante said. "I know." Rafe looked at him for a moment. 11 years was not a short time, and they had never been the kind of men who marked duration with sentiment, but the moment sat between them with a weight that both of them felt, and neither commented on. Rafe said, "You did the right thing." Dante said, "I did the only thing I could do, and still be able to look at the people in that car." Rafe said, "That's what the right thing usually feels like." He left. Dante sat at the table with the prepaid phone and the bad hotel cough in the quiet of a room where, for the first time in longer than he could precisely identify, nothing was requiring him to be someone in particular. It was deeply uncomfortable. He had expected relief. What he got instead was the specific unease of a man whose entire sense of self had been organized around a function that no longer existed the way an injury feels once the adrenaline is gone, and the body has time to report everything it's been ignoring. He sat with it. 3 weeks later, they moved into a rented house on the north side of a town 40 miles outside Chicago. Not the farmhouse. That property had been sold through the shell company as part of unwinding the off-book assets. This was a plain house on a plain street with a front porch and a yard that needed work and a kitchen with good light in the morning. It was Alara who found it. She said nothing about why she chose it specifically, and he did not ask, but he noticed that the second bedroom had a window that faced east and that she had made sure there was a desk in it before they moved anything else in. Nico moved into the second bedroom. He had not been asked directly. It had been offered carefully, without pressure. Alara explaining that the room was there if he wanted it, and that there was no expectation attached. And Nico had stood in the doorway of the room for a moment, looking at the desk and the east-facing window, and had said, Okay, for now was enough. First week, Nico and Dante occupied the house the way two people occupy a space when they're still deciding what they are to other, each careful around the shared spaces, over polite in the kitchen, each finding reasons to be in different rooms. Elora moved between them with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 17 years managing the distance between two people who didn't know they were related, and was now managing the distance between two people who knew, and weren't sure what to do with the knowledge. The second week, Dante found Nico on the porch at 6 in the morning with his laptop and a cup of coffee, and instead of going back inside, he got his own cup and sat in the other chair. They didn't talk. They sat for 40 minutes in the early cold, both of them looking at the yard that needed work, and then Nico went inside. For class, he'd enrolled in an online program quietly, without announcing it, practical decision made without fanfare, and Dante stayed on the porch for another hour thinking about the yard. He started working on it the following day. He didn't have a plan for it. He just started clearing the dead growth from the back fence line because it was something that needed doing, and doing it required him to be present in his body in a way that kept the thoughts from running too fast. His shoulder was largely healed by then. Rafe's stitches had been competent, and the wound had closed cleanly, but the muscle around it tightened when he worked overhead, and he was learning to work differently to account for it. Nico came out on the third day and picked up the second pair of gloves without asking and started on the far end. They worked for 2 hours. At the end of it, Nico pulled his gloves off and looked at what they'd cleared and said, "What are you going to put here?" Dante said, "I don't know yet." Nico said, "You could put a garden. Alara would like that." Dante looked at him. Nico was not looking back. He was looking at the cleared ground with the critical eye of someone evaluating a practical problem. But there was something in the way he'd said it, casual domestic specificity of it, that meant more than the words did. Dante said she would. Nico pulled his jacket on. "I'll help if you want." He went back inside. Dante stood in the cleared yard and looked at the space and felt something he didn't have an immediate name for. Not happiness. Exactly. Nothing that clean. Something more unfinished than happiness. Something that felt like the first honest thing in a very long time. The trust was formally transferred 2 months after the server documentation went to the legal system. The original designation of Silas Vane as legal contact was challenged on the basis of the documented fraud, the falsified placement records, the forged communications, the financial manipulation, and the challenge was upheld. The trust transferred to Nico Marlowe directly the full amount plus 13 years of accrued interest, held in a straightforward account under his own name. Nico called Dante from his room when the confirmation came through. He said it went through. Dante said, "I know. My lawyer called an hour ago." A pause. $4.7 million, Nico said. That's not a number I know what to do with. You don't have to do anything with it right now. I know. A pause. He wrote me letters. Your father. My grandfather. It was the first time Nico had used either word out loud. He said it carefully, testing the weight of it. I read them. Dante said all of them, all of them. A long pause. He was trying to explain himself, the choice he made. Each letter is it's like he was rehearsing the conversation he was going to have with me. A pause. He never got to have it. Dante said, "No. He sounds like you." A pause. Or you sound like him. I don't know which direction that goes. Dante said both, probably. Another pause, longer than the others. Nico said, "I'm still not calling you Dad." Dante said, "I know. I might. Eventually, I don't know." Nico. "Yeah, you don't owe me anything," Dante said. "Not a name. Not forgiveness. Not time. Whatever you decide to give, it should be because you decided to give it. Not because you think it's expected." A silence is on the line. Nico said, "Okay." He hung up. Dante sat with the phone in his hand in the kitchen, with the good morning light coming through, and the coffee going cold on the counter, and the sound of Alara moving in the next room. He set the phone down. 6 months after the house, on the north side of that quiet town, the journalists published the second piece, the follow-up to the initial documentation story, the one that went deeper into the history of the Vercelli organization's financial structure and the Corelli Consolidation Act. It was thorough, and it was accurate, and it named Dante specifically, with his cooperation, which had been the condition he'd negotiated before giving the documentation. He read it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning. It was not comfortable reading. He had done things that the piece described accurately and without mitigation, because he had given his cooperation on the condition of accuracy, and accuracy was not kind to him in several places. Piece described a man who had built power through methods that caused harm in ways he had chosen not to fully examine because the examination would have required him to stop, and stopping had not been something he'd been willing to do. He read it. Alara read it beside him without saying anything. Nico read it later that day in his room and came out and stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at Dante with an expression that was complicated in the specific way that the expressions of people who are learning something difficult about, someone they're also trying to like, are complicated. Did you know, at the time, what some of this was? Dante said some of it, yes. Nico said, and you did it anyway. Yes. A pause. Why? Dante thought about the answer, not performing the thinking. actually doing it, because the question deserved that, he said. Because I had decided that what I was building was worth it, that the security it created, the control it maintained, justified the cost. He paused. I was wrong. Not about everything, but about the part where I decided I got to be the one to make that calculation for everyone around me. Nico looked at him for a long time, he said. That's a hard thing to admit. It's harder to admit it to you than to anyone else, Dante said. That's probably obvious. Nico said, yeah, it is. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter what the article says. I wouldn't ask you to. But he stopped, worked through something. I've been in a lot of places where people decided what was worth it without asking anyone who had to pay the price. That's not unique to you. He paused. At least you're not making me pretend it didn't happen. Dante said, it happened. Nico nodded once. He went back to his room. They did not have the perfect conversation. They did not arrive at a clean resolution in a room with good lighting and the right words. They had was a Sunday morning in a kitchen with a newspaper article and the willingness to sit in the same house afterward and let the day continue. It was more than Dante had expected. It was more than he deserved, probably. But it was real, which was the only currency he had left that he trusted. Winter came early that year. The yard they'd cleared went brown and then frosted, the cleared ground waiting for what they'd decided to put in it. Nico had found a seed catalog somewhere, had folded down several pages, had left it on the kitchen counter without comment. One evening in late November, Dante came home from an errand. He had a job now, a consultancy through a former business contact that dealt in legitimate security assessment, kind of work he was qualified for in ways that the resume did not fully disclose, but that the clients did not seem to need explained, and found Nico on the porch in the dark, not doing anything, not on his phone, just sitting in the cold with his elbows on his knees, looking at the yard. Dante sat in the other chair. They sat for a while. Then Nico said, "Why did you spend your whole life building it?" Dante looked out at the dark yard. He said, "Because I thought if I controlled enough, I could keep the people I cared about safe." He paused. "I thought power was protection," Nico said. "It wasn't." "No," Dante said. "It was the thing keeping me from them. From your mother. From you." He paused. "From being the kind of person they would have wanted to be near." Nico was quiet. He looked out at the yard. He said, "I read all the letters again. Last night." Dante said, "Yeah." He ends the last one, the one from the year before he died, and he ends it by saying he hopes you'll understand, when the time comes, why he made the choices he made. He says he hopes you'll be better at the part he was worst at. Nico paused. He didn't say what part that was. He just said you'd know. Dante looked at his hands. "I know," he said. The porch was quiet. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block a dog barked twice and stopped. Nico reached over slowly, not dramatically, not with any announcement, and put his hand over Dante's where it rested on the arm of the chair. His left hand, the scarred one. Dante's scarred hand underneath it. Dante did not move. He did not speak. He sat with his son's hand over his, and the cold air around them, and the dark yard in front of them that would be a garden in spring, and he let it be exactly what it was, which was not forgiveness, not yet, not a clean ending. Just two people on a porch in November, a father and a son who had found each other 17 years late, in the ruins of an empire that had been built to protect them both, and had failed at that completely, and had left them here instead, in a house with good morning light in the kitchen, and a catalog with folded pages, and the long, patient work of becoming something to each other, that neither of them had the language for yet. Inside, through the window, Alara was at the kitchen table, reading, a lamp on beside her, her face in profile, quiet and still, the face of a woman who had held a secret for 17 years with both hands and had finally set it down. She looked up once. She saw them through the window, both of them on the porch, the hands, the quiet, and she looked back at her book without changing her expression, which meant everything had changed. The night sat around the three of them like something that had decided to be gentle. Dante Vercelli, who had once commanded the most feared organization in Chicago, who had built walls and filled them with power and called it protection, sat on a porch in the cold with nothing to command and no one to answer to and nothing left to hide, and found that the weight he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped feeling, it was finally, at last, gone. What was left was lighter than he'd expected, and harder, and true.